Yeah, I feel so honored to meet you. You're a superstar, and I'm just a lowly nothing. You know,
No, no, come on.
but
I've of course known about you and followed you for many years, but I'm pretty sure this is the first time that we've spoken to each other. Is that
that's
right?
definitely the first time we've spoken, Morgan.
Yeah,
I've seen you all over the place, but uh,
likewise. I mean,
and
I first came about you many years ago. I first heard about you when you bought the lunch with Buffett with Monish.
exactly.
That was how you first came onto my radar, which was obviously incredible. But I've followed you over the years as well, so
Yeah, well,
it's
there's
an
not
honor
much to
to meet you.
there's not much to follow, Morgan. Let's face it. Let's be
Oh, come
serious.
on.
It's not. I'm not the. You know what? Golda Meir said. She said, "Don't be so humble. You're not that great." You know.
That's
Which
true for all of us, for everybody.
uh, some people have true greatness, and I would tell you that what I deeply envy in you is your capacity to write amazing stories and to understand that. And I just don't get any of that.
Well, thanks. No, I certainly appreciate that, guy. Thank you.
And so I've got your book. I didn't quite finish it yet, actually, but I, like I just the opening story of the skiers. I love backcountry skiing.
Yeah.
I've done actually. I reconnected to backcountry skiing when I discovered that I could skin up the side of ski slopes, which of course makes
Yep.
it a lot safer. And
Yeah.
so now I do. And then I've discovered a valley near to where we have a place in Closters where most of the valley is, I think it's the slope starting getting dangerous at above 30-degree slope.
Yep.
So, and I just love being out there. So it's amazing that you started with that story. And
Yeah.
it's kind of
I mean,
shocking, man. I
yeah.
mean,
And it's also, I've actually, so Brandon and Brian were my best friends at the time, but I think I now know, or at least have been like acquainted with 7 or maybe 8 other skiers who've died in avalanches.
are you
It's a,
serious?
yeah, it's pretty shocking how not rare it is. I feel like every season, there are 2 or 3 deadly avalanches in the United States.
You know,
It's
Yeah, I know that there are avalanches here in Switzerland, or there are mountaineering accidents, but I want to believe that not many Swiss people get caught in them. But do you still ski?
I still ski, not like I used to. I
Yeah,
ski with my son who's 8.
yeah.
But I think definitely my backcountry days are long gone. Yeah.
But so you don't do anything off piste now?
Pretty much no. I'd say 98%. Now that I'm skiing with my son, and
Yeah,
he's just getting into it, so
yeah,
we're still on easy
yeah.
grooves.
8 years old is so when my son was 8 years old, my children were about that age. I'd learned telemark at some point. So
Yeah,
I'd go out with telemark skis and they would be on normal skis and it was great. And then eventually they got good and I couldn't keep up with them on telemark skis. So if I'm on a blue slope, I can have some fun with telemark skis. It's very painful, or it's just like it really uses up the whatever muscle it is, something in the front of the legs, whatever you call that.
yeah,
But I would just tell you that it was an enormous discovery for me that I could. So I love hiking, or I love skinning up. I love the fact that I can, just be in the mountains, walking up somewhere. But I'm tired, I can turn around and be back at the bottom of the slope in like 3 minutes or however long it
yeah.
takes. And so if you haven't tried that, I strongly recommend it. Very, very strongly
I
recommend it.
I have some friends who are good telemarkers. It looks scary to me. I feel like particularly now that I get a little older, I don't know if I have the capacity to learn something like that new. Just
Yeah.
going normal skiing is hard enough on my legs. I don't
Yeah,
know if I
no. So
can pick up something new.
my daughter tries to convince me to learn snowboarding, and we've just had a massive dump of snow here in Zurich, and I'm like, I did it once. I'm not going to do all the falling that I need to get good at snowboarding. Not happening. But just leaving telemark aside, with you skinning up, so skis that allow you to walk up, and just doing it up
Yeah,
the side of a slope. So
yeah.
but I'm very sorry for those two friends. That's a really horrible thing to happen early on in one's life.
It was terrible. We were 17 at the time, which I would say like at the time we thought we were like young adults. But now that I look back, I'm 40 now. When I look back, I'm
Wow.
like we were children. We were
Yeah.
kids at the time.
Yeah.
To lose your life as a kid, both what that
Yeah.
does, obviously, like the tragedy for you and then for the parents. Like, oh,
And that you had to, I mean, you lost two friends, and that's an enormous loss right there. And, obviously you're in a relationship with the parents, and that
Yeah.
must just be, it reminded me. And so one of the things that you did that you seem to do so well, actually, and you pick these events. So I read an article. So this is, I think that you do this naturally, but what I read an article by Tom Friedman about how to write a column. And he said, you need to take some event that happened to you, and then you need to use that event to make it illustrative of how the machine works, is the way Tom Friedman called it.
Yep.
And then the column. And then he said, you need to take that and draw the implications. And so I'm reading your book with a sense of envy, because I'm like, I wish I could tell stories like this guy. So you take that's effectively what you do. It seems you take these vivid events, and you take the best vivid events. And one of the things I learned from reading your book is that if you're going to use examples, use ones. So I keep using examples that are vivid for me, but just because it's vivid for me doesn't mean it's vivid for the reader. And you're taking events that are vivid for the reader, but then you use it to draw a general lesson and something that everybody can take away from it. And so, like, but you do it so well, and it's so much fun. And I'm learning these things about, like, who knew? It's actually what you said about Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the key thing in the whole speech.
Yeah, that he like the part that everybody remembers, he was basically ad-libbing it. And it was because this gospel singer in the audience turns around and yells, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." Like, that's an incredible part of the story. That story is not completely under the radar. That's been out for
but still,
but it's like the most important part of that whole story.
I didn't know that story. You're the first person to have told me that story. And sorry, I could go on and on. You can see it's been having a big impact. I've been reading it over the weekend. I wish I'd finished before this call, but I haven't. And then you have Yuval Harari. I freaking love that.
Yeah, it's wild how he, like, he admits there's nothing new in Sapiens. Yeah. He's just taking what other people have already written about sometimes for centuries. But what he did is he just told a better story about it. To me, what's so crazy about Sapiens 2 is that he wrote it in his native Hebrew. So the version that sold 30 million copies is the English version, which was just a translation. It's like the success of that book is just that it was the best translation that has ever been done ever. So many of the translations of my books, I don't fault them for this, are like, not that great. It's really hard to translate a turn of phrase. That was a perfect translation.
Can you read any of the translated books of yours? Have you got, can you, so you're not really sure, I
have no idea. I've heard from others, I won't say which, but I've heard some of the translations are really good and some of them are awful. Right. This is kind of hit or miss. But since there's no way for me to check it, there's no way for me to sign off on it. Like, I have no idea if it's good or bad. That makes it hard.
Yeah, you can't do anything when it's not your mother tongue, but I kind of gave up after a while. So I was super, I mean, I'm a one book guy. I'm pretty sure I will actually, reading you might drive me to write another book. So I've been going to bed the last 2 or 3 nights reading your book, saying to myself, like, look, you can, so I know that I'm getting somewhere in life, except when I'm sort of saying, try and pass what he's doing. What he's doing is not, with the greater respect, what appears to be, it's like, it looks like magic to the outside world, but you're following. I mean, I know that it's got elements of what the Tom Friedman idea. So I was saying, well, try and find the same thing in your own life, and I just can't. I can't do it, But if anything would convince me to seek to write another book, it's reading your writing, actually, and saying, and the challenge would be, see if you can tell a story as well as Morgan can.
Well, I have my own writer, so I look up to, that I ask the same about myself. Some that stick out besides the obvious, like some of the names that, I mean, they're big writers, but they're not the normal names people would bring up. There's an author named Eric Larson, who's written many books. He writes nonfiction history, and his ability to craft a sentence, to craft a paragraph, to not waste a single word, I think is unparalleled. I think when I read him, my jaw's on the floor, not necessarily with the content. The content is amazing. Yeah. His prose is flawless. Yeah. It's so good. Another is an author named Robert Kurson, who's written a lot of popular nonfiction books. He too, his ability to weave a narrative and tell a story is unparalleled. I think both of those people are better writers than Michael Lewis, even if they have a fraction of the fame.
So I have a
And
theory there that I'd like to ask you about, if it's okay, Morgan. So, and I learned this through my experiences with William Green. And, so if what my experience, so William I had a finished manuscript. I promise you, if that manuscript had it was accepted by the publisher, if it had gone to the publisher as is, the book would have sold 1/10 of what it has sold. And it would have been a nothing book, as we've all, and what changed? What did William Green do? He's kind of like so first of all, he took the orange that was my thoughts and he properly pressed it, squeezed out all the juices. But then, what he would say to me is he sort of like reassembled it. He said, look, it's like you've sewn a suit together, but the trousers are coming out of the armholes and the armholes are in the back, and it's like it's all there, but it's just all in the wrong place. He said all he was doing was reassembling it. And I think that, when I've kind of edited work of my children who are slightly older than yours, maybe half a decade older than yours, what I see is that the first draft of anything that we write is our own thought processes. I'm trying to work out what I think about the subject. But really good writing sort of like is involved with the reader's thought processes. And so here's my theory, and then I'd like to get your comment. If I'm really curious to see what you think. It's the so you have to think. I have to think, if I want to write a sentence or a paragraph that is going to go down well with the reader, I have to stop thinking about where my thoughts are and say, well, where are the reader's thoughts? What should I start off with? And then what's going to go next? And what's going to go next? And how do I make their mind easily hop from the progression of ideas, which is not easy to do. And that's actually what grammar is.
Yeah.
Am I making any sense?
You're completely making sense. And I think the vast majority of writers and great writers do what you do. I'll be honest with you. I do the exact opposite. I do the exact opposite. I never once think about the reader when I'm writing. Never. I call it selfish writing. I'm writing for an audience of one, and that is me.
Yeah.
And I write about stories that I think are interesting. I write about topics that I'm interested in. And then I guess there is a leap of faith to say, if I'm interested in it and I think this article is good, readers will as well. But I think writing, I think the phrase know your audience very quickly transfers into pander to your audience. And it's very clear when you're pandering to somebody. So I deal with this, like, for my blog, I don't have an editor. It's just me. But for books, when an editor is going through it, the editor will say something like, oh, you should explain this paragraph a little bit clearer for the reader. And I'm like, the reader? Like, who? Like, no. This is for me. I'm just writing this for myself. I've always thought of my blogs and my books as almost like a diary, like a personal journal just for me. And I think when you are writing for yourself, it's fun. And that enjoyment shows. And I think when you are writing for other people, it feels like work. And that comes across too. You can see that in the writing too. So I think just doing it for your own sake and treating writing like the art that it is. I mean, think about other, big time artists, Monet, Picasso. They were not writing they were not painting for the viewer. They were painting for themselves. They painted what they wanted to see. That's what made them artists. And I think if you view writing as an art, then it becomes much clearer that you're just like, I want to write in a style and a structure and content that I enjoy. And for the rest of my life, I consider myself a selfless person. I want to help other people and whatnot. But for writing, I become fiercely selfish and I just write what I want to write.
Wow. That's really, really fascinating. So the first thought that came to my mind as you were saying that was, Morgan just happens to be lucky that the audience that he's writing for, the audience of one, is similar enough to the rest of the audiences out there that it kind of works. But then as you continued, I don't think that I've never thought of writing for myself, actually. For me, I was a guy who did sciences at high school, and I was always comfortable with equations and charts and diagrams and never really comfortable with writing. And the idea that, so just to understand, you write, you want to create a piece of writing that you would like to read. Is that the right way to describe it?
That's it. I mean, that's always the bug in my head is like, would I want to read this article myself? Not what are other people going to think about it, but I'm a big reader. You're a big reader. I know the kind of writing that I like to read. I know the topics I like to read about. I know the style and the format that I like to read. And I just try to emulate that. And like, to me, it's like the most obvious litmus test. Would I want to read this? It's just like a chef making food. Would you want to eat this, chef? Like, and if the answer is no, then like, come on. But hey, chef, if it tastes good to you, it's probably going to taste good to somebody else as well. And so I think that's the really simple strategy to go in this. I think most people will do their best writing, even if they consider themselves, they're not writers, or they think that they're not a good writer. If they wrote a diary entry that they know nobody else is going to read this, they would actually write really well because the emotions would come out, the structure would come out. But when you write for other people, you use words like therefore, or, you know, like be that as it may, like all these words that you would never use in a diary. In a diary, you just get your emotions on the page, and it's better writing because of it. So I think if you think of yourself as not a very good writer, write a diary entry about the last year of your life and look at that. And I think most people will actually say like, oh, that's actually pretty good writing. That actually sounds really good.
So I discovered in writing my book, which is now almost a decade away, that the best writing came out when I was emotionally activated. So when I had memories coming back that were kind of like present, and there's a kind of a tingly feeling, and I would throw that onto the page. And I found that, you know, what I realized was that when I felt that, I had to write in the moment, because there was the idea that I would remember what I was feeling to put onto words the next day or in 2 hours wasn't going to happen. But then after that, there was an enormous amount of editing to take that and to sort of like rework it into something that was readable. I found that was kind of raw material. There were islands of raw material that then I had to tell a story around. And I get this feeling from what you're describing that you just like throw it out and there it is, and it's great. You know?
I think I think one thing I've gotten much better at as a writer is knowing when it's not working and cutting my losses early. So there's sometimes where like I'll have this idea, I'll go for a walk and be like, oh, that's a great idea for a blog post. Let's go home and write it.
Yeah.
And I'll come home and I'll write one sentence. I'll write the first sentence of the blog post, and I can tell like, no, this is not going to go anywhere.
And so then you cut your losses and do what?
Cut the losses very early. Go think of another idea. Find something else to write about. So I think if there's any skill, it's like knowing early when it's not going to work. And I think I think if there's one thing I've gotten much better at over 17 years, it's just that it's like I'm not necessarily better at knowing what is going to work, but I can tell very quickly and very accurately when it's not going to work.
Fail fast and preserve your energies. And the funny thing is that I can't tell you how many times I've told people who are in the midst of writing a book of one kind or another, and I've told them, and I think that one should go with your advice, not mine, but so I've told them the exact opposite. So what I tell them is I say, look, you just got to keep going through the garbage, and you got to throw out so much garbage until there's no garbage left. And once there's no garbage left, good stuff will come out, and don't worry about the garbage. So I've actually told them, just keep writing through.
Yeah.
And
I do think for most people, if you are doing the selfish writing for yourself, most people intuitively know that they don't want to read garbage. So if you're writing about, the stock market, if this is just for you, if this is just for your diary, would you go on a 5-paragraph tangent about the history of interest rates? Like, probably not. If you're just writing for yourself, you would just be like, what are the key points? Let me tell you the key points. Let me make it interesting and fun with a story. And then we're done. We're done with it. We're done here. So I think it's actually pretty intuitive if you're just doing it for yourself.
But then one last question before we go wherever else you want to go, although I could talk about writing nonstop, and I'm learning plenty, is that it's interesting. So I don't know if it's natural laziness, but so how do I express my thoughts? I happen to not have a notebook with me right now, but I have these kind of like moleskin notebooks that I take everywhere with me, and I scroll stuff down that comes to my mind. Yeah. But that's all I do with it. And I think that David Perel, who I've never met and I haven't done his courses, but I think he's awesome. I think he'd call them fleeting notes. Yeah. But to take a fleeting note or sketches and turn them into something that is, it's an enormous amount of work. I mean, it's just hard work to do that. And, Vitaly Katzel-Nelson tells me he gets up at 5 a.m. every morning and writes for 2 or 3 hours. Yeah, that's hard work.
Yes,
Really
yes,
hard work.
it's really hard work. I've always kept those fleeting notes as well. For me, it's usually when I'm going for a walk. That's when the majority of my good ideas
Yeah.
form, is when I'm walking around the neighborhood, and I will just send myself an email. And then I come home, and those emails, I try to organize it. I have a couple Google Docs that are just a smattering of random anecdotes.
Yeah.
There's no organization whatsoever. I also just started using Readwise, which is an app.
Yes.
I have no dog in this fight. There's no, I'm not getting paid to
Yeah.
promote it. It's an amazing app. It's a wonderful app of just organizing book highlights that you've had. So
From
I have, I think, 10,000 book highlights in there,
yeah.
and you can scroll through it like a Twitter feed of just like, what are the passages that I've highlighted in all the books that I've
Right.
read? Go through it like a
Right.
Twitter feed. And it's like an amazing way to generate ideas.
I'm as I'm kind of trying to reverse engineer how you wrote your book, and I'm sort of getting a sense of at least part of how it was assembled. I've enjoyed Readwise, but it's not something I've used consistently. I've enjoyed Rome research. It's not something that I've used consistently. When I have something that I have to produce, I've found that a piece of software called Scrivener is really, really helpful to me. I don't know if
Mm.
you've ever used that.
No, I've not.
And that, but what Scrivener allows me to do is to take islands of text, or scrivenings, as they would say, and to rearrange them. So if you take the suit analogy that William gave me, it allows me to easily pull the suit apart and rejigsaw it and tell the story in a better way, but preserving the paragraphs, I guess, or
Yeah.
preserving some of the sentences that if I try and rewrite them too much, they will lose all of their power, if you like.
Yeah.
So
One other thing that comes to mind here is that, and so I've always been a one-man band. I don't have an editor. I don't work with a team. I just,
yeah,
from
I'm
start to
blown
finish, it's
away.
all mine.
I'm flawed, really.
But for better or worse, it's always been like that because I've always viewed writing as an art. And no painter has an editor, no sculptor has an editor. You realize when it's art, then it is up to you. And whenever in times of the past, when I have sent it to friends, I'll write a blog post and I'll send it to a friend and say, what do you think? They will come up with 10 edits, and I send it to another friend who comes up with another 10 edits.
And
Send
they're
it to
all
another friend
useless.
who comes, and they're not like, even if they're useful,
Yeah,
then but they're all different. There's no one
yeah,
right answer. And
yeah,
so I think you have to just say, I like this, and that's what I'm
yeah.
going to go with.
And there's the story of that Charlie Munger tells. I think he's told it many times, of the guy who goes to Mozart and says, "Will you teach my son how to write music?" And do you remember the story? And Mozart says,
Yes.
"Yeah, well, how does it finish? Because I don't want to get it wrong."
Mozart says, your son is much too young to be writing music. And the dad says, but Mozart, you were writing symphonies at age 7. And Mozart says, yes, but I wasn't asking for anybody's help.
It's so
Awesome.
great. Yeah, and I find either you're motivated to do the stuff. I mean, in a sense, I don't think I'm a natural writer the way you are, or William Green is, or some of the other people you've mentioned. Either you're motivated to do the stuff, or you aren't. And if you're not, don't sweat it. There's another better life that's ready for you.
Yeah.
Uh,
In my early, so I've been a writer for 17 years.
yeah,
And in my first probably 2 years, maybe 3 years, it just felt, it was a job for me. I just needed a paycheck. I don't think I really
yeah,
enjoyed it. It was just, that was my job. I was young. I graduated college in 2008. So the teeth of the financial crisis, nobody was hiring. And I needed something to do. And it wasn't until I'd been doing it for about 3 years or so before I was like, oh, this is actually fun. I actually enjoy doing this. And
was it
now it's like the classic, like, nobody needs to pay me to do this. Like I really enjoy this. This is fun.
was it Motley Fool? Did I get that right?
Yeah, I was at the Motley Fool
Yeah,
for 9 years. They
yeah.
hired me when I was a junior in college,
Did you
and I
did,
stayed for 9 years.
did you know a guy called Zeke Ashton? As I guess
The name sounds familiar,
they
but
employed many
I don't think our
writers at
paths
the
crossed.
time, and
Yeah, and most of the
I
writers are
yeah,
contractors, so
you're
we
right.
lived all over the country.
That's like around 2003.
Yeah, that was
So
before my time.
yeah, and Zeke got me to write something for Motley Fool, and I found it actually really, really hard. So I'll bring up something else which I think is really fascinating for those of us who are in and around investing, is that um, it seems to me that, and maybe it's one of the things that holds me back from writing more, is that if I want to be a really, really good writer, if that were even possible, I don't think that being a really good writer and being the guy who calls portfolio shots is a good combination, because Well, you said that you write for yourself, and maybe that's the distinction that one needs to make. But if you're writing for other people, or if you have an eye on what is going to play well with the audience, then you're going to have a natural bias towards the ideas that are popular. And most of the time in investing, the ideas that are popular are not the good ideas. And so you actually,
it might be hard as a portfolio manager, as a fund manager, to send your clients a memo that says, I have no good ideas right now. I'm not, or whatever, even if that's your honest view at some point in time. Hard to do that. I'll tell you one example of this that's really important here. Howard Marks could be very famous for his memos
to
investors. He tells a story that when he started writing those memos, nobody read them. He would send them to his clients. He knew his clients did not read them. It didn't bother him at all because he said he was writing the memos for himself. It was a way for him to crystallize his own thoughts on the economy and the investing world. And it wasn't until he had been doing them for 5 or 6 years before they caught on and his clients started sending them to their friends and whatnot. But he was truly just doing that as his own journal, his own diary. And he just happened to start sending them to his clients.
It's really fascinating because it's sort of shocking to me that, I mean, at the core of what you're talking about, writing, and you're by far and away the certainly more successful and a better writer, is in a scorecard. It's all about in a scorecard. And here I am. How many times has Mr. Guy Spier and those of my ilk preached in a scorecard? And actually what I'm learning in talking to you is that I have not applied that in writing.
Yeah.
That's just terrible.
I don't know if it's terrible because I think it's
terrible
natural.
For me.
Well, see,
I'm rubbing my nose in it.
Most writing teachers would say, know your audience. That's the key. And actually, I don't think that's bad advice. It's never worked for me. And to me, the inner scorecard is, I mean, there was a lot of times at the Motley Fool where I could have made way more money for myself if I had written a certain way and written more articles that had less thought in them. But I think my inner scorecard really prevented me from doing that. I'm like, no, I really want to be proud of what I'm writing.
It's amazing.
And so looking back, I think, and I was young, I was 22 at the time. Looking back, I'm like, I don't think I thought about it in this way at the time, but it was just like, no, I just want to write for myself. I don't want this to be a product that I'm selling. I just want it to be, I'm trying to make sense of the world and I'm trying to tell good stories. And I just happened to put it online for other people to read as well.
It's just shocking to me that I'm shocked at myself that all this time I needed to wait until I got a conversation with Morgan Housel to have the idea of in a scorecard. There's another thought that comes to my mind. So literally, you may underestimate the degree to which I'm aware that the capacity to write well is such a superpower. So I was watching lectures, and it's so wonderful one can these days. I won't remember his name, but he's a professor who teaches writing at Chicago University. And in particular, he talks to students about how to write in such a way that you'll get your article published. He's talking to academic students. And a point that he makes very, very, and I'm certain that I still suffer from this disease, is that he says, look, all the way up to probably the end of your undergraduate years, certainly high school, the person who's reading your work is paid to read it. Yeah. They can't get away. You have a captive audience of one, and they do not get to take a salary home unless they grade your paper. Guess what? That disappears after. So I think in some people, they're actually still writing for that, teacher, grader, sort of authority figure of one kind or another. And so
and what do they teach you in school? The teacher says your midterm paper has to be a minimum of 5 pages, minimum of 10 pages. So then you're just going for length. You're trying to meet the length minimum. In the real world, how it works for readers online or in books is you have 5 seconds to catch my attention. And if you don't catch my attention, I'm going to move on to the next blog post. And so it's literally the opposite of what they teach in school. In school, it's go for length. In the real world, it's brevity, sharp, quick, get to the point. And so it's just the opposite of what's teached. It's really freaking fascinating. And but I think that again, I thank you for asking to talk to me, because I get to learn so many things from you. So I'm discovering that all this advice that I'm giving, I may change it completely now. When people say, "Oh, I'm writing my book," I'll say, "Look,
I used to say, just keep writing, let all the garbage come out. But Morgan Housel says, preserve your energy. And what I've also said is, you need to find your muse. So I think of, Charlie Warren has said that he writes for his sister, Doris, I think her name is, and he imagines that he's writing to her sister. But the ultimate is to make yourself your muse. And that's effectively what you've done. What would I like 100%. To read?
What would I like to read? My wife makes this joke that a lot of the reason that what I write is I can explain complicated things in simple terms is because I'm not smart enough to make it complicated myself. Like I don't have the intelligence to explain how the economy works in a complicated way, but I can be like, oh, compound interest is neat. Like that. I'm too simple-minded to do it anymore. And I honestly think there's truth to that the reason I want to use a simple story is because I have a simple mind. I'm just not smart enough to make it more complicated than that.
Do those stories come up for you? Do they pop into your mind? Do you go, so when I'm curious, so, and it's fun because I have your book in front of me, but, I just love this, where is it here? Bear with me. It's the forest in California where it grows a lot, and then you have fires, and then I think it's maybe Wild Numbers is the chapter title. And so you kind of draw a little nub of truth, a little model of reality, and what you're telling the reader is, look, this is a model that you can. I'm illustrating it with California forest fires. But I was just reading, fast growth is often lower quality growth, and now you can apply in different places. I'm curious, does the story come first about a particular anecdote that illustrates the idea, and then you distill the idea? Or is it the idea and then the story?
It's always the story and then the idea. So never will I say like, oh, I have an investing idea, I need to go find a story for it. Never once have I done that. I do, as I know you do, lots of casual, unstructured reading about all kinds of topics.
Yeah.
I almost never read finance books or economics books. I read about history and science and like all kinds of things, always with this seed in my head of how does what I'm reading, like how is that a story that I can twist into a finance tale? And once you start looking for them, you see them everywhere. I mean, just literally just last night, I was on the treadmill running, listening to music. And the Coldplay song Fix You has this lyric where it says, when you get what you want, but not what you need, what could be worse? And I was like, that's so many people's relationship with money, like particularly rich people. You get what you want, but not what you need. You got the career success that you wanted, but you didn't have the family, friends that you needed. So once you start looking for these things, you see them everywhere. You see them in every book that you read, every song that you listen to. You're like, oh, that could be a little anecdote or story that I could twist into a lesson about compound interest or whatever it is.
So so two things come up for me, which is so fascinating. I'm going to tell you a short anecdote directly stimulated by what you said. I promise you, swear to God. So I was lucky enough. So classmate of mine at business school is a guy called Chris Hahn, who's one of the richest people in the UK, biggest giver, huge hedge fund guy. And I promise you, so he used to come sleep on the floor of my apartment. He was penniless at the time that I knew him. And every now and then I see him. And I promise you, during that time, I don't remember apropos of what he said. And these are lyrics from I think a Rolling Stones song. Is you can't always get what you want, but you can sometimes get what you need.
Right.
Which
is it's so true. So there's so many, like I always make the case that the only good thought leaders are comedians. They I think like most good comedians are geniuses. I've made the point, maybe it's controversial, that like Chris Rock and George Carlin understand human behavior as well as Daniel Kahneman. Those guys just understand, well, maybe better. And they're so good at communicating it, of course. And so like there's a George Carlin joke where he says, everyone driving faster than you is a maniac, and everybody driving slower than you is an idiot. Like there's like, it's a funny joke, but it's like, there is no better explanation of like social relativity and how everyone anchors what's going on in the world relative to you than that. And so all of these guys, whether it's like a comedian or like music lyrics, you see it everywhere.
I didn't even know who George Carlin is. I've heard the name, but I've never listened to any of his. I know Seinfeld, I know a few others, but so then the second thought that is really fascinating for me. So uh so Anthony Robbins talks about something called, and I'm going to use a bunch of jargon, and I'm really embarrassed. I just want to tell you that it's Anthony Robbins jargon, not mine. Reticular activating mechanism. And I think his point is, when your brain pays attention to something, that is significant. It doesn't matter why it started paying attention. What we need to, so, some people say, oh, I had an omen, or I went to see a tarot card reader, or a black cat crossed the road. And I think that my point is, don't worry about, don't get, people like me, rationalists, want to get into starting to get down on superstition, and don't be superstitious. But for one reason or another, your brain conjured up that thought. Focus on it, because there's something there. And what seems to me is happening with you, like you're listening to music and you notice something in the Coldplay song. There's reasons below the conscious surface as to why you notice that, which is important. And you're, so maybe let me just suggest to you that actually it's not that you pick the story picks you.
I think that's right. I do think, what I said earlier, that I never start with an idea and try to find a story. I think that's true, but it actually might be indirect, that I have ideas in my head. And when those ideas are in my head, then it's going to be easier for me to find the story. And so maybe that was the case last night. I'm writing a new book right now.
Another one.
Yes.
My God.
And
congratulations.
Thank you. And there's a chapter that I'm working on in which that Coldplay lyric fit in perfectly. So obviously this chapter idea is something that's been in my head. And then when I heard the lyric, I think it was easier to make that connection because the idea was already there.
So I don't know much about psychology or consciousness, but there's, I believe, theories of consciousness where you kind of can think of consciousness as the stage onto which the brain projects stuff that we see. So all we see is kind of what is being lit up on the stage. And it's just, I guess, what I find interesting. And I feel like, so a thought that I think I've expressed to my children maybe is, even if we don't believe it, if we make the assumption that the world is showing up in the way that it is, especially for us, it's kind of like a belief in God in a certain way. God has made the world for us. Every single thing in it is showing us up for us in a certain way, because there's some meaning that we have to take from it that we haven't yet taken from it. I suspect that many of us, including me, would become better writers if when a thought leaps into our mind, instead of either dismissing it or kind of like, you just say, wow, there's a reason why the universe conjured up a configuration in which this thought leapt into my mind. Now I have to make meaning out of that, And
I think so much of it too is like finding value in the mundane. Jerry Seinfeld used to talk about that. He and Larry David would like go to a deli and watch how people ordered, and they would come up with bits for their show about that. And just like in the mundane. And that's why the show was so good. That's why Seinfeld was so good. It was about ordinary life.
He's a philosopher of life.
Yes, really. Absolutely. But I think there's a lot of that, of like when you're reading a scientific paper, instead of just taking everything at face value and letting the words just like wash over your brain, stop and think about like what that means. It's a really basic idea, maybe kind of a cliche idea, but I think there's a lot of things when like, if you like, one thing I've changed in my reading over time is I used to read for sport. And what I mean by that is it was a game of like, how many books can I read this month? And I would plow through them. Yeah. And when I was done with it, without thinking, I would just move on to the next book. And now I read much fewer books than I used to, and I read much slower. And I go out of my way to, if I read a paragraph that I think is profound, I'll close the book and just sit there and think about it. And when you do that, then you start connecting. You're like, oh, actually, it reminds me of this idea from this other book, which reminds me of this other thing that I read recently. And that's when you start connecting those dots. And something that, like a paragraph that may have been mundane to me when I was reading for sport, all of a sudden I start connecting the dots in ways that become really profound to me.
Now, you read off a Kindle, obviously, because Readwise works really well with a Kindle, doesn't it?
I go back and forth. I've had periods of my life where I'm just Kindle, periods of my life where I'm just physical book. Readwise is actually pretty good. You can actually just take a picture of the page with your phone and it loads the text right into Readwise. And it's very well done. It's very seamless.
I haven't fully used Readwise. I do both. I read, and now at night I really read in the Kindle because it allows me to sleep next to my wife, who doesn't like it when I put the reading light on. But
Yeah.
wow. So because so many places to go. What is what arises for me as you say that is to ask the question, what is the underlying motivation that you have for reading what you're reading? So you talked about reading for sport. And then, the second one that I feel like is sort of like reading in order to savor great writing is
Yeah.
what it felt like to me. And and this, I'm not proud of this, but it is a factor in my reading. So, I feel like there's so many recognized great works of literature that are around that I have not read, and I've said it in multiple places. I don't want to die having not read them, so I've set myself a
Yeah.
project of reading some of the world's great literature. And first couple of times I tried to read War and Peace, I failed. Then we were in Russia 2019 for the World Cup, and we did a day trip to the birthplace of Leo Tolstoy. I was just curious to see it. I never pronounced it right. It's about a 3 or 4 hour drive south of Moscow, Yasnaya Polyana. I'm so glad we visited at the time because I'm not sure I'm going back to Russia anytime soon. And then after that, I read it. But maybe that's kind of reading as self-flagellation. but how do you decide what you're going to read next, or how many books you're going to read concurrently, or fiction versus nonfiction?
This might sound weird and completely contradictory, but most people read to become smarter. And of course, like there's that element for me. I also think and this might sound crazy, I think I read to become dumber, for lack of a better word. What I mean by that is I get a lot of pleasure when I think I understand a topic. Oh, I understand World War II. I know exactly what happened. And then you read a new book about it that brings up all these points that you never knew before. And the feeling that I get is, oh, there's actually so much that I don't know. And I get a lot of joy when a new door is opened that I didn't know existed before. And it highlights what I didn't know before. It highlights how ignorant I was before I read this book. That's where I get the joy from. And to me, like that's like it's reading to become it's opening your eyes to how dumb you were before you read this book. And I like a lot of people, my certainty about how the world works peaked when I was 19. When I was 19, I thought I completely understand how the world works. My opinions were very firm. And the more I read, the smarter I get, the more I'm willing to just put up my hands and be like, nobody really knows much. Like we can learn some core principles, but man, there's so much out there. Fiction versus nonfiction. I'm not proud of this. It's something that I wish was better, but I never read fiction. Or
isn't it fascinating for somebody
very, very rarely?
And you're reputed, and I think you are an excellent storyteller. Isn't that so fascinating?
So I think so. And one of the reasons, at least this is my excuse, is the real world is crazy enough for me. There's enough just completely out of the world stories in the real world. You don't need to make up a crazy story. Enough crazy real ones already exist.
Yeah.
That's part of it. The only time that I've really enjoyed fiction is when it's like historical fiction. It could have been true. But even that, I find myself, if I'm like getting emotional about the topic, and then I realize I'm like, oh, by the way, this never actually even happened. This is even true. I'm like, that's not very exciting. Again, that's a character flaw. I wish it was different. I've tried, I've experimented, but I gained so much pleasure from nonfiction.
So, what happened to me, and I don't think that, so obviously, I mean, memories fail us, but I think that this is true. I mean, I have I'm supposedly ADHD. My mind jumps. I love nonfiction because the book has a historical or some kind of subject matter structure. If I lose my place, I can find it again. I can skip to the part that I'm interested in and not lose my way. And obviously, stories are not like that. And then, at one of the Wesco or Daily Journal meetings, Charlie Munger is asked about whether he reads fiction, and he says, "Yeah, I don't read much like you." And like I don't read much fiction anymore. I did it for a while, and I think it's all the same thing. It's all the same thing. So, and that really irked me. I don't know why it irked me, because I in part in rebellion against this man that I adulate. I said to myself, I'm going to read fiction. I want to make a case for you and see what you do with it. The case for fiction is, in a sense, starting with the Bible and starting with, age-old tales like the Nibelungenlied or the Odyssey, is that these are stories that are told and retold by great storytellers in order to illustrate something that is true to their readers and listeners about the human condition, about humanity, and especially the old classics. When these stories get honed, in a way, they contain more reality because they are told in order to help the listener or the reader reveal something to the reader or the listener that they haven't yet seen. And so the argument to you would be the reason why you want to read fiction is because it is even more true than nonfiction. How did I do?
I believe that. And I'm not against fiction. Even though I don't read it, I wouldn't say, oh, I don't read it because nobody else should. So many people who I admire have come to me and said, look at how like this fiction book changed my life and opened my eyes in this ways, in a way that I'm like, oh, I wish I had that for myself.
Yeah.
But I sit down and I try it and I'm like, this is just not working for me.
And I do believe, and I know this is a grandiose statement, but I do believe it to be the case that so I ended up reading War and Peace we did a family trip to the Antarctic, and we had, I don't know, N days crossing the something strait. I don't even remember the name of the big strait that you have to cross from Ushuaia down to Antarctic. And that's a very rough sea, and you've got like 3 or 4 days of misery, and there's not much you can do. And I do believe that I became wiser through the book. Now, the book goes through 3 generations, and there are some personalities that you read about again and again and again, and they become like old friends to you. There must be at least 10 that become like old friends to you. And the idea would be that there are these kind of archetypes of personalities. And so I'll give you an example. So I decided that I was going to read a bunch of coming of age novels. Bildungsroman is what the word in German is. And so I selected a bunch. One of them is David Copperfield. And in David Copperfield, so William Green and I are talking about somebody that we both know. And there's something that both makes us both uneasy about this person. This person is a really wonderful person. There's something that makes us uneasy. And William Green, who's studied English literature, he says, yeah, it reminds me of this personality in David Copperfield, Uriah Heep. And because I'd recently read David Copperfield, I'm like, my gosh, that's absolutely right. And I had a model of the kind of like very accommodating, very socially appropriate person, but somehow gives you a queasy, uneasy feeling. And so, just like a painting, like Monet's Impression Sunrise, kind of crystallizes a way of seeing the world through kind of like half-opened eyes. This Uriah Heep personality crystallizes a certain kind of thing that humans feel. And by reading it, you become actually a more wise human being because you've had more experience around that. Something like that, I guess, is the idea.
Guy, what percentage of what you read is fiction versus nonfiction now?
So here's look, nonfiction is way easier for me. And look, so this is really funny. If allow me to step away from a second, and I'll show you. Bear with me. So. So I wasn't planning on doing this, Morgan, but now that you're here, so I got because I'm all upset about what's going on in Israel. I'm reading this woman, and I want to see if it's a book. And I met her recently. So there's an element of reading, which is I want to get to know the person behind the book. And I happened to meet Noah Tishby. So let's see. A dear friend died of glioblastoma. And there's a book here, there's a story about glioblastoma here. So I got that. And then I saw I saw David Brooks give a graduation lecture. So I decided to read his book. I was meeting this amazing writer called Morgan Housel. So like
heard of him.
Wait. So hang on a second. I missed one. What's this? Shane, I haven't yet read this. But bear with me. I got to pick up a couple more here.
Yes, please do.
Okay, so here we go. So it's like a ratio of about 6 to 1. So so this woman, so this came up because I read. Can you see it? Because I don't have my self view on. So
yes,
She was mentioned by a guy called Simon Sharma, who's a columnist and a historian, an amazing guy. And then I'm working this is my Bildungsroman. So this is Stendhal, Le Rouge et le Noir, which I'm reading in French. And it's just like, it's agony, actually.
Wow.
This is agony.
What languages do you speak that you can read fluently in?
So I can read in French and German and English.
Wow.
But I speak Spanish, and I have the ambition to read something in Spanish, but I haven't read a full book in Spanish. And my Hebrew is not really good enough to read a novel in, or to read a newspaper, actually. But I have this ambition. I'm running a lifelong experiment in which I don't have the time to go and study Hebrew, and we don't live in Israel. But I have a subscription to the Israeli version of the New York Times. It's a newspaper called Haaretz. And I kind of like do a best attempt to read the headlines. And the lifelong experiment is, if you regularly try and read the headlines and just like try and puzzle it a little bit, will your Hebrew improve? And I think that the answer is no, actually.
it's not enough. You really have to fully immerse yourself to get it done.
The honest answer is I'm a nonfiction reader as well, but I really do feel I'm kind of like, I feel like I've missed out by not reading by not reading as much fiction. And I really am envious of the people that I know who've read a lot of fiction. I feel like they have a take on the world that I wish I had.
Yeah, I mean, I'm exactly the same. That I wish it was more. And I get, maybe this is a bad analogy, but it's like the people who like took mushrooms at some point in their life, and it like opened up their worldview into like something else that they couldn't explain. Steve Jobs talked about it, lots about this a lot. And it's like, it's a window into a new world that you did not know existed before. And a lot of people explain fiction like that as well, in a way that when I hear it, I'm jealous of it. I'd want it for myself. I just haven't really figured it out.
It's just and what I love is your honesty. You're not. This is in a scorecard, but so I take it you haven't tried psychedelics, despite Michael Pollan's.
I have not. No, but when you hear about people who've done it right, which is a big asterisk in there, it sounds amazing. It sounds amazing, and opens their eyes into a new world that they didn't know existed, gave them more empathy, gave them more love and whatnot. When you hear the people who've done it right, it sounds great. The danger there is like for every one of those stories are 5 or 10 horror stories of people who it really messed up, even if they're doing it was a bad trip for them.
I've got to deliver a talk to a group of mathematicians that I'm slightly nervous about, and I don't. It's the real world for mathematicians, something like that. And one of the things that I'm going to bring up, I want to demonstrate to them what a small proportion of the knowledge that they have, these are master's students, is actually applicable in the real world. And one of the things that I want to bring up to them is this concept of, missing sample size. So a lot of the time people draw a conclusion about the world, but they don't realize how skewed their sample is. Yeah. And so, people who go through difficulties right after they're married do not talk about it, and they do not write books about it, Yeah. And I'm realizing that people who have bad trips on psychedelics, it's not something that you talk about it, is it?
You don't talk about it. No, it's so true. This is true. And I think social media makes this so much worse. Everyone is putting forth the best version of their life, the best pictures, the best ideas and whatnot, and they're not putting forth the hard parts of it. I'm sure it's the same for psychedelics, of course.
A friend that I used to know in New York, he lives in Switzerland. I haven't seen him physically, but he was posting all this this vaccine skepticism stuff. And he's like, look at this example of this famous person who took the vaccine and regrets it, or look at this famous person who took the vaccine and then got sick of COVID. I kind of said, do you know why there are no people who didn't take the vaccine and had a bad experience? Because they're all dead.
right.
And
I think it's something that even Kahneman talked about, where I forget the exact word. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he realized that like a lot of the research that he had done was probably based off of inadequate sample sizes. Yeah. And maybe this gets to why there's such a replication crisis in social science. Of the study comes out showing X, Y, and Z, but it can't be replicated because the sample you are pulling from, for a lot of these samples, it's undergraduate college students, which can be a very homogenous group in itself, not just in age, but in socioeconomic status, whatever it might be. And so that's a big problem in the world. I think one other way to phrase that is forget about sample sizes and studies and whatnot, but everyone is just viewing the world through the lens of their own experiences.
Yeah.
What I have seen and experienced firsthand is different from what you have.
Yeah.
And therefore I have different views in the world that you might disagree with, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Not because we necessarily disagree with each other, just because my experiences have taught me X, Y, and Z, and yours have taught you A, B, and C. And everybody does that and falls for that flaw. I don't think there's any exceptions. Everyone views the world through their own lens.
We're all holding on to different parts of the elephant, you know? So I have two questions that arise in my mind at the same time. So I'm going to give them to you and see which one you go with. You know, the guy who wrote Lyndon Johnson, Path to Power, and Robert Caro. So I've read him with a desire to, because another thing, I don't understand how to write. I don't believe. And although I've gotten amazing distinctions, I'm going to put to work after, you know, maybe even as early as tonight. Another thing that I feel I don't understand very well is power. And so I've read Robert Caro with the conscious desire to learn more about power, and especially Lyndon Johnson, you know, Years of Ascent. And I haven't read it all. I've read parts of it. And all I learned is that I wouldn't have liked to have done what Lyndon Johnson did. I mean, I wouldn't have liked to have lived that life. But I guess there's reading with the goal of I guess acquiring a skill, I guess acquiring knowledge about an area. I mean, it seems like you read quite a lot of history, and there you're just curious to know what happened actually.
Yeah. And I think another relevant point here is I love to read biographies of very successful people, entrepreneurs, generals, politicians, whoever it might be. I can't think of one biography of a very successful person who I read, and at the end I thought to myself, I want to be that person. I wouldn't, like, never. It's the opposite. I get to the end and I usually think, I'm so glad that person existed because they changed the world in these ways, but never in a million years would I want that life for myself. A lot of it is because the success that they had was because they devoted their life to one thing, one business, one cause, whatever it be. And that came at the expense of everything else, including their family, their friends, their health. And I would never want that for myself. So that's a lot of it. I think if you're learning, if everything you read, you're like, oh, how can I implement this in my own life? That could be very dangerous. I think it's important to read. And the majority of what you read, you think that's interesting, but that's not for me. And I understand why you would think that, but it's not for me. I always like, let me give you a specific example. I'm pretty open with the fact I dollar cost average into index funds. That's how I invest. I am not the kind of person who would say that's the best way to invest or that you should do it. What I would say is like, look, it works for me. It works for my wife and I, but everyone has a different risk tolerance. Everyone has different aspirations. I have no aspiration to be the greatest investor in the world. And because of that, it's like, okay, I would rather spend my time with my family and writing. And the investing strategy that I have gives me infinite bandwidth. It takes none of my bandwidth to implement that in that strategy. But it works for me. So I think if whenever you read about a successful person, you think, how can I do that in my own life? I think that's dangerous. You have to figure out who you are and what works for you.
And there's this idea that you know, I don't know where I read it, but you want the bits of success that they had, or you want bits of their life. You don't get to get bits. You either get to get all of it and all of the pain that they went through to get that, or you don't get any of it. And you know, this was brought home to me. I kind of like, I remember the feeling I had when I, you know, because what I discovered on this charity lunch is that Warren Buffett is this actually very, very narrow person. His range of it, and he would not disagree with me, I don't think. His range of interests are extraordinarily narrow in comparison to Charlie Munger, for example. He's actually at his happiest discarding the broad range of reading that you or I would have, and just reading company reports and figuring out how to compound money at a high rate. And at some point, that's kind of a very narrow life, actually. And what I realized—
But it works for him. It works for his personality.
And that's what's really important. It works for his narrow, slightly autistic, Asperger's, whatever it is, personality. But that's not my personality. I love trying to learn Hebrew while I'm trying to read a book in French, while I'm, dreaming of all of those things. And so it was at that point where I realized you don't even try to be that guy, because you would be miserable to be that guy.
And I think you can contrast that with Munger, who I think didn't spend that much of his day thinking about investments. A lot of it, part of it, but not like Buffett. I think Munger
Yeah.
spent most of his day thinking about Ben Franklin and astrophysics and
Yeah.
politics and Singapore and all these other topics that Buffett
Yeah.
probably spends very little time thinking about.
But
And both of those guys had ridiculous success and were honored and admired in their own way for who they
yeah.
were.
And I'd be miserable if I was in Charlie Munger's shoes and I discarded all of fiction, because I feel like it's really enriched me. So,
Right.
two other, or an area that I'm curious to know what you've done with is that, so I'm not a big poetry reader, but I am drawn to poetry. I like to take poems to the toilet with me because and read a short poem. And the poet that has just really, I really don't understand it. And I'm not a student of English literature, and I haven't spent a lot of time reading around this. But T.S. Eliot, I don't understand his poems, but I find they move me in ways that I don't quite understand why they move me.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm not a reader of poetry, and I have read some of it. What I admire about poetry is that it is the ultimate brevity. Every single word needs to be there. You can't remove a single word.
Yeah,
That's what I really admire about it. And to the extent that you can communicate a book's worth of emotion in 5 lines, whatever it would
yeah,
be, that's incredible. But it's never, what I like are stories. And I think I think even by my definition, a poem is the opposite of a story. A poem is just like, what is the essence of the emotion in as few words possible?
yeah.
And a
A
story is like,
distillation.
let's build up a narrative about what happened here. So it's never really appealed to me. But I would put that in the same camp as like fiction. I know a lot of people, maybe like you, that poetry has been a, a big part of their life and has really broadened their knowledge of the world in a way that just hasn't hit me.
I was as college student, and the guy came up today in the context of a discussion about coal, believe it or not. And he was a law student, as I was, and from Australia. And he invited a bunch of friends to his room from time to time, and would sit there with poetry books. And you could either flip it open at any page, or you could pick a particular poem and read it to the group. And it was kind of like a fascinating, I guess, it taught me something. I don't know what it taught me. I think there's no life that, I'm not sure that I get any life wisdom out of appreciating a beautiful work of art, of visual art. But it's just beauty, which has its own reason. And I guess some poetry is like that. It's just something beautiful that is there and was created, and you appreciate it, but it doesn't give you there's no ulterior motive for consuming it,
Right.
So
It's probably the most artistic form of writing that exists.
yeah. So, but yeah, and something that, I made myself read. Sorry, I'm taking you to all these fiction books, and I really ought to get off fiction, because you've kind of been clear that it's not an area that you're particularly spending time in. But I'm going to stop with one, because it illustrates something about me that I don't particularly like. Even is that I've been, throughout my life, actually quite instrumental in my choices. So at school, I played rugby, not because I liked rugby, because that was the sport that you played if you wanted to be well respected in the school.
Yeah.
And I wasn't particularly good at it. And you could have done soccer, but the most important sport at that school was rugby. So I played rugby. And so there are various things that I've done in that way. And it kind of, and so at some point I decided I didn't want to have died without having read Ulysses by James Joyce. I made myself read Ulysses. And so I've not tried psychedelics, but when I was in my 20s, I did pot 3 or 4 times, marijuana, maybe a few times more. Didn't particularly enjoy it. What I figured out about reading James Joyce was that it was easier to read when I imagined myself high on pot.
if you were not high, but you imagined yourself being high.
Exactly. Well, just imagine yourself slightly drunk, slightly woozy, not trying to take everything in on a critical level, and just letting it sort of like waft over you, something like that.
Yeah.
But
Like don't think too deeply about it. Just let it hit you emotionally.
yeah. But I would tell you that anyway, so I'm going on far too much about esoteric aspects of writing, if you like, but fun talking to you and discovering what you read and what you're into. Where are you calling from? I didn't even register
Seattle.
where home is. Seattle.
Seattle.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's not that cold there. It's beautiful.
How much time do you spend in the States?
Um, as the guy who prepares my tax returns would confirm, less than 183 days.
Awesome.
Um, my eldest daughter just started at Barnard,
Yeah.
so
Great.
I think that it's working out at about 4 or 5 trips a year, and
Cool.
each time I'm there for anywhere from, you know, 4 or 5 days to 2 weeks, might be even 3 weeks at
Did
some
you,
points.
are you born and raised in Switzerland?
Oh, it's so complicated, Morgan. So no, I'm an immigrant to just about every country I've been connected to. So I was born in South Africa, but
Wow.
left when I was 3 months old. My mother's
Okay.
originally South African, and we lived in Israel for almost 4 years.
Okay.
And then we moved to Iran. I lived in Iran for 7 years. And then age 11, we immigrated to the UK, where I went to a weekly boarding school. And then at age 21 or so, I left the UK, never to live in the UK permanently again. The longest at this point I've lived anywhere is the United States, where I moved when I was 24 years old to do an MBA and stayed for 18 years. And
Yeah.
then kind of one morning with, I married Laurie, my wife is Mexican, and I mean, a number of things came together, but the result was that I woke up one morning and knew that we had to leave New York. I'd lived on the Upper West Side for 18 years, and having decided to leave New York, I felt like nowhere else in North America was worth living, and so I wanted to come back to Europe, and my wife was up for it, and so we came back to Switzerland because I didn't want to go to dark and dreary, poor copy of New York City, London,
Yeah. Exactly.
and came to Zurich. And so now we've been in Zurich for, I think it's 15 years now,
Great.
and
Great.
we've become Swiss citizens. And
Great.
I've held on to a couple of other citizenships, but now our children are rebelling. So age kind of like 11 or so, our children all decided they didn't want Swiss schools. They were interested in British boarding schools. They ended up, all three of them, in British boarding schools. Our youngest daughter is back here. And I think
Wow.
that it's quite likely that at least two, if not all three of them, will end up students in the United States. And
Incredible. That's such a cool background. It's so like, I feel like in Europe, that's maybe not that extreme, but that's more common, where in the United States, I feel like the majority of people have never left the state in which they were born in. There's just not a lot of there's just not a lot of exploration like there would be for somebody in Europe.
you know what's I mean, I think that what happened to me, the first year I was at business school, the first year I was living in the US, all my friends were Europeans, and I kind of had this very snobby attitude towards Americans. And then in my second year, I discovered, great friendships with Americans, and learned that, reality, or the way you interface with reality, is different in the American mindset. And once I got into the American mindset, I fell in love with it. I mean, I stayed 18 years, and there are so many aspects of being in the United States. Like you say, oh, people don't travel. People travel a lot in the US, probably more than in Europe. And there's absolutely nothing to be, quote, ashamed of, or sort of like, oh, the Europeans are better at XYZ. It's got to do with the unique nature of the North American continent, and how European immigrants went and lived there, and the very special legal and political system that developed there. And I would tell you that, in a way, the only reason why I felt comfortable leaving the US is, I joked, I'd say, well, in a way, I'll always be a New Yorker. And in a certain way, my identity was honed in New York City. And having become confident in my identity, I don't have to be in New York City to be that person. But I don't think I could have become who I am. So I would say that there's a piece of the United States that's always with me, and
that's great.
yeah. And no, I mean, I'd go beyond that. I wrote this in a recent newsletter. I mean, the United States is, again, I believe, the arsenal of democracy, the last great hope of mankind. If freedom in the United States were to ever die, then God help humanity, is what I believe.
Yeah,
And
I think it's true. Yeah.
And so I'm a great American patriot. And there's a American general here. I think he's retired now, but I think he must have a German wife because he lives in, I think, Frankfurt, General Hodges. Like, he's American through and through, and he lives in Germany because probably he married a German woman. His children are at university or whatever they're doing in Germany. He's an American. And in a certain way, for me, Europe and the United, I mean, I don't think this is an original thought, but it's okay because I'm talking to Morgan, who's told me in his book that it's okay not to have original thoughts. Europe and America is so similar to Greece and Rome. I mean, and I don't know much about ancient history, but I understand from the people who do that the Greeks viewed the Romans in the same way that Europeans view Americans, and the Americans view Europeans in the same way the Romans viewed the Greeks. The Greeks were supposedly more cultured, and they'd speak two languages. They'd speak Latin and Greek, and they had all the original artworks. And in Rome they made poor copies, and they were kind of crass and all of those things. But I think that many of the world's most sophisticated Europeans end up living in New York City. So in a way,
it's probably right.
If you want to find some of the very, very best of what Europe has to offer, you need to go find it in New York City.
Wow. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but when you say it, it seems right. Like it's obviously like that mecca of drawing people in.
And actually, funnily enough, London is no longer a part of the European Union. Much of the best that you can find in Europe, you find in London. I mean, I was at the annual meeting of this company. It's an investment company called Exor, which is run by John Elkann. It was just last weekend. It was in Turin, but the head office, investment-wise, is in London. And their equivalent of Delaware, where the company's registered, is Amsterdam. But London, in a way, it's kind of like a capital of Europe, even though it's outside of Europe. And in a way, New York City is the capital of the free world. I don't want to move, and I love there's in the summertime I love swimming in the lake, for example. And in a couple of weeks I've spoke to two of our children who can't wait to go backcountry skiing with me, only on 30-degree slopes where there's no avalanche danger. I just want you to know that.
Right. Yeah.
And but there's many aspects of life in the US that I really, really miss, or that I would be so happy to be a part of. And let's just say that natural beauty, the infrastructure here, I don't know when the last time you were in Switzerland is, but infrastructure is so neat and it's nice to look at. It's aesthetic. And so much infrastructure in the US is kind of really ugly. I mean, you have a few exceptions. You have the Golden Gate Bridge, you have the Verrazano Narrow Bridge. There's some really beautiful, but a lot of the infrastructure is just damned ugly. But you know what? So you're not there for the charm of the infrastructure, but there are other aspects that are just incredible. And I feel like I remember walking around MIT, it's like 5 years ago. I started to say, wow, they've really gotten, so there's ways to organize urban, sort of like the interaction between pedestrian areas and roads, which makes it safe for pedestrians and forces cars to slow down. And you don't use traffic lights, and you kind of use road markings that confuse the driver and make them go, what's going on here? And they slow down. And I was seeing parts of MIT campus which were exactly like that. And I was thinking, wow, in a certain way, this is more European than many cities in Europe that haven't yet done that. And so my daughter and I and a friend went to see an opera called Malcolm X. Never thought you'd make an opera about Malcolm X, but and I was sitting there in the Metropolitan Opera in New York and thinking, this is better than any opera house I've been in Europe. So it's really, it might be the world's best opera house. And so some of the best culture that you can find is actually in New York City.
I love that. That's great.
Yeah,
that's great.
Don't worry, I'm not some snob. I got rid of that.
some European snob. I love it. Guy, I feel like my voice is going out quickly enough that I don't know if it's best for either of us to continue this much longer.
But this has been, I didn't know what to expect. I genuinely was nervous. It's been so much fun. I've been almost been leading the conversation. I hope that this is what you were expecting to do with me.
Of course. I mean, I followed you for years, and we should do this again sometime. We should, if we make this a semi-regular thing.
I would love that.
I'd love it.
So I didn't realize you're talking about your voice going was like, I need to go. So I got it. Tell me and you can put all of this online. It's totally fine. But Yeah, we need to find a way to connect in person that's convenient to both of us. I don't
Yeah.
know when that's going to happen, but
So I'm in New York 4 or 5 times a year. I travel quite a bit all over the US mostly. But I'm here in Seattle. And certainly if, if you're in the States, the next time you're in the
yeah.
States, shoot me an email and we'll
Yeah,
try
I'll
to
do
figure
that.
something out.
I come to close to you for the TED conference. I think I'm going again this coming spring, and I don't know if you ever think to come up to Vancouver for that. It's not that far away.
Yeah, no, it's a 2-hour drive. It's not too far away.
Yeah.
Yeah, shoot me an email when you're coming. It'd be great to meet up.
I'll do that. Morgan,
Yeah.
it's such a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for giving me
Likewise.
the honor of talking to you,
Oh, I'm so glad. This was years overdue. I'm glad we finally did it.
Well, I'm delighted. And I don't know who recommended it or how it happened, but I feel better.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I will try to rest my voice the rest of the day.
Yeah.
It's been so much fun though. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Morgan. Talk to you later.
All right. Take care. See ya.
Yeah. Bye.